So it'd be nice if, okay. Yes, I guess the streaming is now ready. So I'd like to invite the first speaker of opening government to open the case for the debate. Here.
All right. I just want to check that I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. Okay. Religion is one of the most important facets of almost everyone in the world's lives. We say that it would be much more preferable for these religions to follow a Gadol rather than any alternative official supreme leader. So I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, I want to describe to you and conceptualize what we think this world is likely going to look like and what the comparative is on op. And secondly, I want to explain to you why this is going to be better for the world in a myriad of ways. The first thing I want to say before all of that is that I want to say that 80% of the world subscribes to some form of organized religion right now. This debate affects the vast majority of people on either side of the house. We are value neutral on whether religion is good or bad, but we care more about the marginal change to religion and its institutions resulting from this. So then, firstly, what does this world look like? Two things. Firstly, we imagine that this world would have had religion arise with these gadols, right? Hierarchical religious institutions, when first evolving and establishing legitimacy, would have had to account for the existence of these public religious prophets who have a huge degree of public support and would have developed different belief in institutional structures based on this rather than based off of what we see in the status quo. Secondly, the way in which these gadols were chosen would also evolve over time. In earlier times, they might have been chosen through more informal mechanisms where the majority of believers organically coalesced around one figure. In modern times, it's more likely that advanced religious institutions would have developed voting systems every generation, which we say is around 20 to 25 years, among their global membership to select this person. Lastly, I just want to note this. In the cases where the gadols fall out of popularity or begin to stray from the will of the people and the religious leaders around them are still able to co-opt interpretations of ideology that favor themselves, likely preparing for the next gadol to come into power. And note importantly here, right, this is also a mechanism for why these gadols are more likely on our side to stay accountable to the people. The entirety of their legitimacy is still deriving from the people throughout their reign. Their influence is still heavily influenced by what the people think of them, however much longer or shorter their term might be, depending on when the people decide the new gadol should come in. Secondly, then, what is the comparative on opposition, right? Op needs to defend a world in which official supreme leaders exist and in which these leaders are explicitly chosen by members of the hierarchical religious institutions rather than by the consent of the broader religious communities. And importantly here, these are going to be official supreme leaders that do have say over how the religious leaders need to act, taking away what we're going to prove to you is a crucial link into how religion can actually better the lives of people. So why then is this better for the world? This would have resulted in norms developing in which religious doctrine placed greater weight on the needs and opinions of the public, right? This means a few things. Firstly, we want to note that in the vast majority of cases, the religious institutions op defends will also do what the public wants. If the majority of believers believe in one interpretation, they will probably move in that direction towards religious institutions which preach those views. However, there are cases where hierarchical religious institutions are in explicit tension with the public good. This typically arises due to their institutional design, right? They're undemocratic and have supreme authority and power due to their claim as having a monopoly on that which is holy. This creates a huge potential for abuse by these institutions, right? They're institutions that have been able to justify a lack of transparency and accountability for their activities based on having the only legitimate claim or only connection to a god or a religious doctrine. This is particularly true because religious institutions are structurally underrepresented for a few reasons. Firstly, members of the clergy often have a specific familial background or a religious education that was inaccessible to a large number of people. They grew up in different situations that are more ideologically orthodox as a result. Secondly, members of an upper class that is economically distinct and cares less about people's day-to-day issues. And thirdly, they have coercive power to get people to entrench their influence, e.g. collecting taxes or tithes that will entrench the advantages and keep them insulated from public will. The upshot of all of this means that these people are structurally structurally going to be underrepresentative or unrepresentative of what the people want. On our side, the Gadals change this, right? Gadals act as a megaphone for the public and can bargain with religious institutions to get better institutional structures on the ground. That is, if people see religious institutions acting against their interests, Gadals can make claims about how that is not in line with the doctrine or representative with religion, and institutions risk losing all of their legitimacy to these Gadals in response. Institutions therefore have to be much more responsive on our side to demands for transparency, less hierarchy, and greater access. Why is this good? Two things. Firstly, religious doctrine can reform in ways that are more representative, right? If people feel that doctrine is overly restrictive or coercive, e.g. making people pay too much in tithes to churches or banning people from practices more moderate doctrines, the Gadol has an incentive to respond to these demands, and religious leaders will account for this. But secondly, institutions become more transparent and less vertical, which means barrier to entry is less, right? The people who join these institutions are more representative of the public, and the abuses of power are easier to check. This means that there are less instances of exploitation of the poor by religious organizations, less cover-ups of sexual abuse and violence, less predatory behavior. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from CO.
Given that there was a lot of historic competition between different religions for recruitment early within history, isn't there still a broad incentive to do what the public wants in order to get people to choose your religion over others?
Yeah, I already admitted that there would be, in general, a lot of religions that would generally follow what the people want. I'm talking about how, as time passes, why it's unlikely that these entrenched power structures will create abuse long term. So lastly, then, I just want to touch on why are the other religious leaders likely going to follow the best parts of the Gadol, but not the worst parts, right? The first thing to note here is that the religious leaders are likely going to eye or vie to become the Gadol in the future, right? They will find the best possible doctrines and religious practices that allow them to buy into the hearts and the minds of the people. And note here, there's a comparative, right? The religious leaders that want to, in the future, become the Gadol are the ones that want to gather as many people to support them as possible. On the other side, it is more likely that the religious leaders that are seen to want to entrench the power of the current structure or are likely going to retain the power of all the other lackeys are more likely going to be the ones that will be put up for a Gadol. And so this means that the incentive structures of religious leaders that might become future Gadols structurally changes. Although it is true that the Gadol does have influence over other leaders, it will be nowhere near as strong as the influence of an official leader that necessarily has control over the other leaders, right? So this means that there's an inherent checking and balancing system that guarantees not only A, the Gadol currently is likely going to be good, but also that B, future Gadols will be good, and C, the religious leaders that may not become the Gadol but are still in powerful positions are also likely going to follow the hearts and minds of the people. In the comparative, it becomes structurally impossible to resist all of this because of the hierarchical nature and the coercive nature of religious institutions. I'm so very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now let's invite the leader of the opposition. Here.
Great. Can I confirm I'm audible?
Yep.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Centralized religious authority is good because it slows religious conflict while ensuring you get harmony in doctrine that allows religions to operate at larger scale. The problem with the Gadol is that they inherently create divisions in religion that make them far worse while slowing the moderation of religion. 1, religious hierarchy good. 2, individual relationship with God, why they're better. 3, when we get liberalization and moderation of religion faster on our side. A point of framing, the comparative in this debate. This house prefers a world debate with a counterfactual world on op. We are not defending the status quo. We're defending a world in which all religions follow a supreme religious leader. What this means that historically, and note that this is within the debate insofar as this prefers a world debate per the WDC manual, religions must have been more unified and had to coalesce faster around individual religious leaders because a prerequisite for a supreme leader to exist within a religion is that they have a large degree of collective will and they are acknowledged by that supreme leader as a large number of people. Because in status quo, lots of religious leaders don't have leaders because they're constantly fracturing because of doctrinal interpretations, we stop that constant fracturing. What this means is that on our world, religions must have been more unified, which means not only is our world one where you don't have historical divides in Islam like the Sunni-Shia divide, we get to defend a world where tons of infighting between large religions simply did not happen. Insofar as arresting the historic progress of religious war is something that is an incredible benefit on our side in the House insofar as they save a lot of lives, and this just outweighs most of opening government, even if it is the case that they get faster progressivism within religion because fewer people died on our side of the House due to inconsistencies in doctrine that were exploited by leaderless religions that just don't exist in our world but can exist in their world because you can have a Gadol but still have no hierarchy in their world. All of those religions religion still fracture, all of those wars still happen. What did OG say in this debate? They say that the Gadol will be elected. Note the motion says that the Gadol is chosen by collective reverence. I don't know how that operates. They didn't tell us, but it doesn't operate via an election, because the comparative in our debate is that the acknowledgement of the official institution is what is the mechanism by which the leader comes into power. This can look like the Pope, where it's chosen by bureaucrats within the religion, like cardinals and bishops, but it can also look like the Unitarian Universalist Church, where there actually are elections to elect an official leader. Our comparative claim is that this is better because those people are more likely to be responsive to the religion as a whole, which I'll explain in constructive. But note that if their framing is true and it's an elected battle, you probably turn religion into a massive political game, because running for Gadol is not the same as running in the College of Cardinals, where it's chosen behind closed doors. It's even not the same where you have a vote where you tally every single elected official to hold power. It's probably really bad, because there's probably multiple people running for Gadol, which incentivizes, heightens polarization, probably gets the most energized conservatives, and that's probably really bad for infighting, as I'll prove in constructive. Now let's talk about why this leads to infighting within religion. I think this is really important. Note that even if the Gadol's authority is something that people collectively buy into a large extent, there are always power-hungry people within an institution who have an incentive to challenge the Gadol. This is because the Gadol is one person who has no official authority, who operates outside the structure. Insofar as the Gadol's priorities are like not to deal with mundane and day-to-day stuff like running a religion, this necessarily creates contrast and conflict between the people who are running the religious bureaucracy and the Gadol itself. But note that even if the Gadol isn't being challenged by individuals within the religion, which we admit probably happens in fewer instances, note that you don't just keep people challenging the Gadol, but you get infighting between two different factions within a religion more often than the Gadol cannot arrest. Note that in their world, they don't have a centralized religious hierarchy that can arrest that decline. And even if they do, there's competition between the Gadol, and the Gadol can't weigh in on that conflict between the two religious factions, insofar as the two religious factions there's no mechanism of formal authority by which the Gadol can stop them. There are four ways this causes really bad fracturing. Firstly, when you have a single religious leader, they can standardize doctrine across multiple spaces and places. This means there's more harmony in religion in general, which means there's less infighting, because an official leader can implement standardization in doctrine, in the way it's interpreted, and in rules and regulations in terms of the religion. On their side, the comparators of the Gadol, who lacks formal authority, cannot standardize each local interpretation of religion between townships, cities, villages, and different countries as well, because they lack that official authority. This means create openings for power people to challenge the Gadol or challenge other local religious hierarchies that the Gadol have no authority over and cannot stop. All this means there's likely to be far more clashes over doctrine and interpretation, more internal strife with the religion, and more violent religion in general. Secondly, on their side, you incentivize conflict between the religious leadership and the Gadol, internal to religious leadership, because it's unclear which you follow when there is a doctrinal difference. There might be a local leader who's very popular, for instance, who competes with the Gadol for followers. When there's more competition between leadership, this incentivizes hostility within the religion, which arrests the development of the religion. Thirdly, a supreme religious leader on our side usually has buy-in from the rest of the religious leadership. They're voted in by leadership like the Pope. This means there's an active cost to undermining that leadership on our side, because you're going against the will of the people, or at least the will of the elites within the religion. Compared, there's no active cost to undermining the Gadol beyond you're going against someone who might be popular in some instances, which is far easier to undermine the Gadol than a formal religious structure. Finally, the will of the people is just likely to be fickle, which means the Gadol is likely to be paranoid and very responsive. They say this is a good thing. I think it's really fucking bad, because it reduces the consistency of the religion even further, which is harder for the religion to operate at scale, do things like charities and things like this, insofar as the Gadol is more likely to change policy at various rates faster. Fifthly, the Gadol will be incentivized to pander the most radical members in space. The reason this is true is because these are the ones who can make the most trouble for the Gadol, because they're the ones most likely to critique the Gadol if the Gadol's statements differ from formalized hierarchy. What this means is the Gadol is likely to be radical, conservative, and quite bad in many instances. I want to weigh this infighting point quite highly in the round now, because infighting religion is bad for three reasons. One, on the individual relationship you have with their God. This creates disharmony in the soul, insofar as now you see conflict and strife within the religious hierarchy that you follow and hears very closely within your spirit. Insofar as this causes conflict internal to you, we think that is quite bad for you, your relationship with your creator, and your relationship with spirituality in general. Secondly, this leads to violence and people dying, which is a maximal restriction on agency way higher in the debate. Thirdly, larger hierarchical religions just don't develop as quickly because they fracture at far higher rates. So you get fewer charity donations happening at scale, mass charity projects that alleviate massive amounts of suffering in places like the developing world and so on and so forth. These things just don't happen on their side of the house. Before I explain why we would get a mechanism to moderate religion in this debate, I'd like to take a POI from CG.
To clarify, how do you envision the forceful standardization of many of these doctrines? How do you envision the supreme leader to bully people into line and to ensure that everyone follows?
I already explained why it is highly likely that in the manner in which these religions would have had to evolve, there was a prerequisite to buy into the supreme leader's authority. This means it is highly unlikely that there's this degree of infighting. But note the comparative, the Gadol is unelected. It happens through collective reverence, which can be fickle, and there are more incentives to challenge the Gadol insofar as they operate outside the formal hierarchy of the structure. You're being on comparative with the POI. Note that the reason why we get more moderation within the religion, and this is crucial because this flips the OG claim about how the Gadol can be really responsive to the will of the people and so on and so forth, is because the Gadol is unchallengeable. The Gadol cannot lose Gadol's authority. The motion says there is only one Gadol per generation. This means the Gadol has no incentive to moderate, and the only people they have any incentive to listen to, if anyone at all, are radicals within the religion. Note the comparative. Religious leaders like the Pope who are elected by elites, but also the Sheikhs of Al-Azhar who are elected by the populace of Egypt, or the Unitarian Universalist leaders who are elected by the church itself, have to be responsive to the populace that put them in power. What this means is the Gadol has no incentive to appeal to a lot of people, that is, many individuals, because they can't lose their status as the Gadol no matter what. Even if they lose popularity, they're still the only Gadol for the generation. The comparative in this debate is that religious leaders, which are hierarchical, have an incentive to pander to their constituent groups to keep themselves in power via elections over time. This means that if large numbers of progressives and young people are leaving an institution like the Catholic Church, the Pope has an active incentive to pander to those individuals because he can lose out on tithes, donations, and exercise of authority over them. This means that large numbers of people are leaving the Unitarian Universalist Church for another religion. The leader of the Unitarian Universalist Church or the leader of the Mormon Church will get voted out of office the next time they run, which means they actually have to win over constituents and everybody else in order to stay in power. This never happens on side opposition when you have the Gadol's authority that is absolutely unchallengeable, and even if they become unpopular, they never have the incentive to pander, except maybe to radicals in some instances. More infighting is bad because you get more death, you arrest the relationship people have with God and the soul, you get less moderation of religion, incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
Cool. I will start time now. I think opening opposition is unambiguously out of this debate when they try to win by assumption. They try to win by a definitional challenge that because this house prefers, we can also just assume that since the only way that the thing that we talk about could have happened in a reasonable way was if everybody agreed on religion, then the Sunni Shia split never matters. Meaningful ideological differences never matter. This is a ridiculous proposition for them to make, and I'm going to explain why. Firstly, because the definition that they give you of religion is the thing on which all of this hinges, right? They say, well, if Islam, for example, is one religion, then if there's a single supreme leader, there necessarily must be one single Islam, right? If that definition were true, then we could equally fiat that there would be buy-in to never having Sunnis and Shias, and everyone agrees on who the real prophet was, and everyone chooses the Gadol based on that interpretation. But that's not what happens, right? Sunnis and Shias, in the same way Protestants and Catholics, are meaningfully, for the purpose of this debate, in our view, different religions. They have different practices that they actually go to. They have different things that they believe in terms of who's God and what kind of things that God can do. And insofar as that is the case, this is a largely symmetric claim. The change that we are making is not on the extensive margin on the number of religions, but on the intensive margin within any given religion. That is, even after the fact of the competitive incentives between religions, which Naomi points out in a POI, once people get locked into a specific doctrine and they have been raised in it for a couple of generations, and they're unlikely necessarily to move out of it, at least in the short term, then them having a democratic check against that religion makes that religion better for them, even if in the long term you could econ 101 it out, and eventually there would be competition that brings them into other religions. The second thing I want to point out is that the buy-in that they talk about that you necessarily need to have is not just presupposed to be something that's achieved through having winning the hearts and minds of people, right? You can get people to buy in lots of ways, and especially if we regress back into history when religion really came to the fore, I would argue that the way that this buy-in was achieved was probably through fear of infinite damnation or control of land, which many religious institutions had in many of the countries we're talking about, control of workers who quite literally worked for the religious institutions that they talk about. You can attain buy-in through coercive mechanisms, and all of the conceited argumentation Brian has given you for why these institutions are run by people who are structurally unrepresentative on the margin more than the people who are democratically elected proves that this is the thing that was most likely to occur. That then flips all of the arguments they've given you for why this creates religious conflict, because that kind of discontent that foments over time is what eventually causes large breaks with organized religion when people have been abused by those institutions for so long because those institutions were not listening to what those people cared about. So we'll turn this argument and prove why splits are less likely. The other thing I want to deal with before we talk about the fracturing of religion and then weigh up our argumentation is this idea that you create a massive political game and that people become polarized, right? I think that their ability to imagine the world that we're talking about is severely constrained because what they've essentially done is taken the religious polarization that exists right now and then mapped it onto elections that happened 500 years ago. The argument that we're making is that the reason why religious polarization exists is because there over time comes to be a split between what the institution wants and what the public wants, and those splits are not properly assessed in time. There's not a good accountability mechanism, because even if religious institutions in principle would like to adapt to what the people like, they don't have a good way for assessing what the people want. And people in the short term are beholden to their material conditions. And so the vast majority of them don't have the resources to go and try to be a member of the clergy or reform it from within. But a gadol is a low-cost way for the public to change this. It creates a bargaining position for the public to bargain with those institutions to get changes that meet them in the middle and achieve compromises that make polarization less likely, which also means that downstream, when elections occur, those elections are less polarized. I will make you note that they themselves also say that their religious hierarchical members are selected by elections by today, right? So elections exist on either side of the house. The question is, do we start doing them hundreds of years later, once we've created a norm that religious institutions are run by a small class of people and only a small class of people are engaged in the construction of those institutions? Or do we have it after having democratic norms established in religion that have been built up over quite literally hundreds of years, such that you are much less likely to have this polarization? I think that they are unambiguously out of this debate. Before I talk about the specifics of their case, I want to take one more POI from the closing opposition. Okay, opening.
Great. The problem with elections in your world is that they are unaccountable because the motion explicitly says that the gadol cannot be voted out. Once it's set for a generation, this means you don't get the kind of longer term accountability you want, which is why this
I've
is
heard
not
your point. So first of all, Brian explained that a generation is 20 to 25 years, depending on the time period we talk about. Religious institution figureheads like the Pope or people like that are generally in power for a similar amount of time. Secondarily, we've explained to you that just because you have a gadol does not mean everyone guaranteed will buy everything they say. If the gadol goes off in the wrong direction, they will lose legitimacy relative to the religious institutions that now have a strong incentive to position themselves as better than the gadol and ramp up legitimacy, position themselves to be the next gadol, for example. So there is more of a competitive check. But the argument that you just made for unaccountability is the same reason why your entire advocacy of centralized religious hierarchy falls, because the same thing applies. There is just zero check in your world. This is a very bad POI for your side. Their warrant about fracturing. The first point they make is that on their side, they will standardize doctrine. Again, this presupposes that religions can perfectly convince people. We explained to you why official authority is not a mechanism. Insofar as the gadol has actual public buy-in, it's more likely that they can standardize doctrine in a way that is actually amenable to the real material conditions of people. Secondly, we told you that in order to convince people effectively, you need to reflect their material conditions on the ground, but we gave you structural reasons why the people in these institutions will never be able to do that, because they are quite literally out of touch. We talked about how these individuals grew up in specific families that were far more orthodox, were educated in a particular way, were members of an elite economic class, and they were able to use institutions in the initial instance to foment those advantages by having things like taxes and tithes and making people who work on the land of the church do certain things, such that it is very unlikely that they will actually standardize doctrine in a way that people will accept one generation down the road. They say secondarily, there is a cost to undermining the leadership, and so you will just not want to work with the gadol, you will instead work within the institution, right? I think we've explained to you why the institution does want to position itself in a way that people will like it, but the gadol is a mechanism to gauge what the people actually want. And in a world in which they don't know that, the fact that these people are out of touch means that there is a time delay between the people's minds changing and the gadol, or whatever, the institution's minds changing, such that you create much larger splits when those divides add up over time, and then there's a breaking point. Finally, they say the gadol will be the most radical. I think that given the comparative, the people who are very, very orthodox, very plugged into religion, and who have explicit influence, but also have no accountability, are more radical than the vast majority of people who have contradictory material conditions and need to come to compromises. Also, I just think OO does not have a normative claim to what is intrinsically good religion and moderate religion. The best claim we can make is religion that reflects the material conditions of people, which is something we've uniquely mechanized on our side. They say the supreme leader doesn't have to change because they keep their role. I've answered this argument. At the end of the round, this is less about ideology and more about institutions. What we explained to you is, firstly, that if ideology matters, getting a sense of what people actually care about earlier on and having those people bargain with institutions makes it more likely that they reform to reflect ideology, preventing splits and preventing religious conflicts. But secondly, even if ideology is the same on either side, institutions matter, right? If we can make churches a little more transparent, a little more horizontal, and a little more accountable, it means that they won't tax people the same way, they won't abuse women and children, and they will actually take care of the people that they are designed to protect. We are exceptionally proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now let's invite the DLO. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, audible.
Great. POIs, please put them in the chat. Don't verbally interrupt unless I'm cutting out. What do you have? Can you put for me the water? Yeah, sorry, Matt's just getting me some water. Okay. Great. Three, two, one. I think Matt already won this debate. He explained to you why the fucking Sunni Shia split probably wouldn't have happened or would have been very unlikely to happen. I think like mitigating a lot of religious war is a really cool impact, but the other stuff that Matt gives you is also pretty important. I'm going to explain why we get it. And it was just very sad for OG not to properly engage and give us a weird model, because I would have expected like a little bit better in a like Yale final, you know? A bit of characterization. The infighting and splintering that Matt tells you has to exist insofar as the Gadol has no authority over the other religious leaders. Matt explains why having a single supreme leader means that religions fractured less historically. The mechanism he gave, which Devesh ignored, is that when every religion has a leader, you don't have as many leaderless religions that are prone to fracturing or war. What this means is even if we get the Sunni Shia divide, we don't get leaderless religious movements that are constantly fracturing and infighting. So even if we get some religious conflict, the point is that we prevent them from compounding and escalating over time to create even more conflict. The institution, however, has the capacity to mitigate that infighting and splintering, specifically because of the hierarchy that OG says. Their own analysis for why this religion might be unrepresentative is specifically why they are able to hold elements from splintering and dividing the religion. They cannot have their cake and eat it too and say it can't be representative because it's so singular, but oh, it's also not singular and not able to stop people from splintering and destroying the religion, creating infight, right? Like they have to like take one or leave it. So let's get into the two clashes then that otherwise exist on infighting and splintering against like in religions. Keep in mind, the reason why it is more likely to happen on side government is that even if the Gadol is only one leader and he has like the people's reverence, there's no authority over any of the other leaders below him that still have a degree of authority, right? There's no centralized authority to construct a hierarchy of leadership. Now, why might there be incentives for lower level leaders that can still fight against each other, even if like the Gadol might disagree with them, right? One, they might have different interpretations or beliefs. Or secondarily, they might just be power hungry and want a little bit more. The point is that they say, and their response to this on Gov is that if the Gadol goes rogue on their side, the religious institutions will get stronger and try to marginalize the Gadol. The problem with this response is that when the religious institution now has an incentive to diverge from what the Gadol says, this creates one more point of contention within the religion. This is what creates the fighting. This is the mechanism for Matt's case that they give when they try to rebut it. We stop that fighting or that rogueness potential from happening in the first place because the institution is hierarchical and prevents it from happening. The comparative is we also have one leader, but the institution has authority over everyone below. That is to say, the institution creates a hierarchy because norms and rules adapt over time to make it stable and clear so that it's long-term. That is to say, there's a reason why institutions like the Catholic Church or other entities can exist like that for decades and centuries because it's inbuilt in to make it like a singular body moving. Also, I want to make sure, like to weigh this argument, like in particular. Matt already gave you good weighing on like the conflict and like preventing a lot of that conflict and schism and infighting and agency. But I want to, even if you don't buy that, having a singular institution and giving you clarity on the path to follow and what to do to go to heaven is incredibly vital for religious people. Why will you weigh that singular interpretation, even if it means it's more unrepresentative, far more than any other argument in the round? One, it affects people's self-actualization. That is to say, their capacity and their identity to say, I am a good Christian or Muslim, but it's hard to know what it takes to do it when there's so many conflicting texts. When there's one institution that is dictating it and not like infighting and splintering, I know what I have to do to go to heaven. But also it's an infinite utility harm because the perception that I might go to hell because I don't know what to do creates infinite suffering because there's massive fear and paranoia and internal dilemma of what do I need to do so I don't suffer for the rest of my life when I die. So even if we become a little bit more unrepresentative, I do not know why that matters more to religious people insofar as their ultimate goal is to go to heaven. That is to say, their primary identity and preference when they follow this religion is how do I access being a good thing? You give them a clear path and blueprints to follow on our side. Secondarily, on moderating religion, they say it's going to be unrepresentative and less inclusive on our side. They have two links to this. If we rebut these links, they're out and we win this clash. One, that these people are unrepresented because they're largely from the upper class. That's asserted. I'm going to counter and give a reason that most religiously devout people tend to be poor. I think those are the people that are probably going to rise through the ranks and be representative. The rich people are probably just going to go become consultants. I don't know why they become fucking priests. Secondarily, they say official institutions don't have to answer to the people. Keep in mind, the upshot of this is that they use this to rebut our schism argument, because they say if we're more unrepresentative, people will leave the religion. So if we rebut this, we rebut their rebuttal to our case. How do we make it more moderate and inclusive, responding to that first mechanism of official institutions don't have to answer to the people? They have the incentives and capacities to moderate. Why is this the case? One, they want to counteract declining religious populations that inevitably happen at some point over time by making it more inclusive and moderate, so people don't feel too conservative or out of date. Or two, for example, they want to compete with other religions and proselytize. So they want to also be more appealing to other people, and they have to have a lower common denominator to attract those people. But it's important because it requires an effort to make religions more inclusive. You have to build, bridge different groups, hold classes and teach-ins, fund scholarly institutions that provide these interpretations. There's not an incentive for the Gadol to do that, because he's the only one leader, and he's the leader regardless of how successful, inclusive, or broad that religion is. There's no incentive to put in that effort to accumulate the people to make that religion more inclusive. CG, quick, do you have something?
It seems to me that accountability thing seems to be substantially worse if you are a supreme leader with codified power that you can use to reinforce and entrench your own rule. Like, what happens if you just roll a bad policy? Are you just screwed forever?
I think there exist accountability mechanisms within the hierarchy and institution, insofar as they give you reasons why they want to be more inclusive or accountable. But I don't know why, if the OG characterization is the Gadol is able to represent the interests of the people, why if he doesn't give a shitty policy, people won't like otherwise, or like why that's any comparatively different, right? Like the unique difference is that with religious institutions, at the very least, like shitty decisions might happen on either side, but at the very least, there's less conflict, infighting, and splintering, and people know what the fuck they have to do to go to heaven. Like at our worst case, if they both give shitty decisions, then that's fucked, right? Like there's nothing you can do about that. Secondarily, keep in mind that the unique comparative, right, is that they say that the Gadol is democratically elected. But I just don't think this is true, right? Given that the motion explicitly says that the Gadol is not chosen by the people, but even if it is, the elections in their world that exist to moderate or represent the people are far worse, because there's no longer term accountability. So if they care about accountability, it's far harder to hold the fucking Gadol accountable when he's there for 30 years. Like, what if social perceptions change and he's a dickhead and he says, no, I don't really want to like give gay people rights because like I don't think they should. Like you're stuck with them for 30, 40 fucking years. Even if we get less accountable, like there's more accountability that can exist on our side insofar as the timeline isn't secured and there's incentives for them to moderate. Never been prouder to oppose this motion. Fuck the Gadol.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now moving on to the closing debate, I'd like to first invite the member of the government. Here.
I'd like POIs in the chat, please. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. We think religions would be way better if they were local, if they had very little power over you, and if they had almost no hierarchy. That's going to be the crux of our extension today. The first thing I want to talk about is why they're substantially less hierarchical. And this sounds like an OG argument, so I want to explain first why it's not. OG's claim is that the hierarchy disappears because this institutional capacity is less calcified over time, because at the top level, you can still elect the leader. The problem is that even if you were to get rid of the Pope, it is still the case that at a local level, you have bishops, you have cardinals, you have priests, and all of these people are still better than you, are still having substantial more wealth than you, and therefore their capacity for abuse is still pretty large, because the person at top one, once they get in power, wants to use this hierarchy to make as much money as possible, but two, cannot control everything that goes on. So we're going to substantially widen the scope of OG's impact by talking about how in the long run, this hierarchical structure disappears almost entirely. Why is that likely to be the case? The first reason is to talk about what sort of things we think these leaders are likely to be elected on the basis of. I think there are a couple of things that are probably true. The first is that priests are often likely to be resented on the grounds that they have closer ties to God. That is, if the most important thing for you is feeling like you fulfill your religious obligations, then having someone who can tell you what to do, who can constantly makes you feel like you're not living up to that, is an expert, probably makes you feel really bad. I think feasibly, this doesn't mean that you want to overthrow them, and wouldn't in the case where supreme leadership exists. But this does mean that if someone can tell you there is a way that you don't have to feel like that, you're very likely to take them up, which means that people who run on a platform of saying priests around you are no better than you, have no more connection to God, have no more authority, are likely to get substantial amounts of support. But secondly, these people are often resented for having better outcomes. That is, that the local priest will get their church in like maybe a little flat in an apartment nearby, whereas other people have to scrounge and work in the fields and do backbreaking labor. Therefore, again, it is very likely that people who campaign on the basis of defunding these organizations will do very well. In the long run, that means that one, on almost all bases, these people find it far harder to extract rents from local people, which A, is an independent good, but B, means their capacity to sustain themselves in the long term is decreased. But secondly, this dramatically decreased the incentive for people to actually want to be a priest, for instance, because it's no longer a cushy life, that in the long run dramatically disrupts these. The second thing is, I think, again, the incentive is to disrupt this institutional capacity, because if you are the Pope, say, having come up through the bishop and cardinal, A, we think that you're far more likely to believe that these things are valuable, and therefore when you're in charge to continue to allocate money to these projects. By contrast, if you are just elected by the people, you're far less likely to think that's the case, and therefore want to steal money away from these people, because that allows you to have as much power as possible and not to have the possibility of the kind of fracturing that maybe happens. So for those reasons, I think, again, the incentive exists to dramatically weaken these sorts of institutional capacities under our side of the house. What do we think this looks like? I think in the long run, it means it becomes fairly untenable for priests to ever exist. For one thing, like the government salary or religious salary is just very, very variable, because you get far less of this support under their side. Why is this a really good thing? The first thing is, I think it suggests these abuse claims from OG are substantially more true under our side, because I don't think OG can, at best, is saying you can engage in some kind of dialogue, and on the margins you can change the policy. We say there is no priest. The priest can never tell you how much money to take, because everyone is equal in a brotherly community, and that is substantially better for reducing the capacity for the kind of oppression they want to talk about. Secondly, you feel much closer to God, because the kinds of obligations that people immediate to you can tell you you need to fulfill and insist you cough up money, which is very difficult for these people to do and therefore makes them feel very bad, goes away entirely. This is an enormous benefit that I think OG doesn't talk about, because for these people, religion is often a necessary way of making life worthwhile, given historically there's been very little fun and it's very, very backbreaking labor, and feeling like you're going to go to heaven is the one thing that redeems you. So making these people feel like there are people that directly will cast aspersions into whether or not they're good people for the sake of institutionalizing religion is very good. But thirdly, religions have much less institutional power, because in the long run, they have way less money for local indoctrination and suppression, and they aren't able to collect tithes for the institution of violence. That is very good, because often there are substantial allies between religions and feudalist systems that have incentive to leave people at the bottom. So we think disempowering these systems means that peasants are no longer going to think it's okay to continue to work for the king, and are far more likely to have the kinds of peasant uprisings that happened in the 18th century instead happen in the 15th century in Europe. That means that we get away with hundreds of years of oppression that these people need to live under. The one thing I want to respond to is the claim that we get from opening opposition, which is about violence. The incentive people to compete for influence is symmetric, and CO points out that religions will still compete anyway. The difference is that on a local level, the ability to conscript you to potentially die in a crusade, right, is much less if there is no one on a local level you believe could ever tell you that religion would require you to do such a thing, because independently it's unlikely you would conceive of a religion which tells you to potentially have massive sacrifice and give up your family, etc. So we think the likelihood you can ever persuade people to fight for religious causes decreases substantially. Second thing I want to say is that we get much more local religions, that is, people decide on what they believe based on far smaller and closer knit communities, and that's very good. Before that, I'll take opening.
She says that religious hierarchy will still exist and hold the Gadal accountable. You say religious hierarchy will disappear over the long term, which means the Gadal has no accountability and there's far more chances of fighting. Peasant rebellions sound really bad to me. Isn't a religion that's a bit repressive but offers clarity of doctrine and stability for its adherents better?
Let's just talk about history, right? Because all of this stuff about peasant rebellions being bad sounds like they're saying the American Revolution was bad, the French Revolution was bad. All of these revolutions that overthrew people for the sake of democracy and having their views represented were bad. Maybe they happen. We say they happen once to overthrow the hierarchy, but then we tell you people are very unlikely to fight when they don't have these large oppressive institutions that are able to compel them to do so and aren't able to tax them to pay for arms. So I think in the long run, we solve this problem. OG says that they were likely to get less fracturing and less violence, but this mechanism is contingent on proving that people have homogenous views. We think the main way this happens is through the localization of religion. Why is this likely to happen? That you likely conceive of religion as happening on your local community. One, that there are no longer hierarchical ties, as per a first argument, that allow for standardization. But secondly, who the Gadal is likely to vary substantially from area to area. Because if it is merely a question of who you revere, then in the case that you have substantial ethnic minorities or geographic minorities that don't agree with who the majority elects, this person is now likely within that community to be seen as authoritative over that community. This doesn't happen in a hierarchy because the principle is not, do we support this person? Does that grant them moral authority? But rather the principle is of whether or not this hierarchy, which has always existed, is likely to lend them substantial credence. This means that what in the long run happens is I think when people feel like they've never actually met this leader, they're far more likely to turn to people in a local area and then splinter off in this actual mechanism. By the way, this is also a reason why violence is much less likely to happen, because if people are never going to respect your leader, then de facto they don't agree with your religion, which means you're never able to war over people because violence is never sufficient to convince them that you believe them. The impact here is, I think, again, we get substantially less oppressive and violent religions because people are far more likely to have homogenous views amongst local communities, which means that the risk you incur of trying to oppress other people by enforcing their religion on them is substantially less likely to be feasible. We're far more likely to have small, close-knit religions that very accurately map onto the local preferences of people, which again, I think is a stronger mechanism for making sure that people aren't subjected to arbitrary restrictions than what opening government says, which is asserting that you get some kind of political progress over time. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now let's invite the member of the opposition. Here.
Please offer POIs exclusively in the chat. I'm going to be talking about two things in this speech. Firstly, actually characterizing how the Gadol is chosen and why that's likely to be really problematic and unrepresentative individuals. And then secondly, why rule is likely to be in a way that is extremely more paranoid and out of touch with the people. Clash will be integrated. On the first extension of the characterization of how the leader is going to be chosen, I want to start by responding to closing government here, basically say that like really, really small regions are going to have their own Gadol. Our main response to this is the reason why this cannot be too localized and too small is a high level of intersubjectivity that exists when it comes to religious belief systems. Given that there is no scripture that is outlining what God is, the key way that a particular religious leader is going to get legitimacy is by intersubjective buy-in, where a large number of people within society are worshiping the same individual that you are. If there are like 300 Gadols existing around the world, I don't think that you're ever going to get the necessary legitimacy to actually get people to buy into a particular individual. So at the very least, I think it's more likely to like take the form of like major religions where there may be like 2 or 3 Gadols existing, or at the very least, like each country in a larger region having their own Gadol. I think that a second observation here is that if their characterization was true, we could probably just counter assert that the same thing would happen with supreme leaders, i.e. why could the church just not deploy like a single powerful leader on a regional basis? They don't do this under the status quo for the legitimacy reasons that we gave earlier. Given all of this, let's actually characterize how the Gadol is likely to be chosen. Because I think that who the person is logically prior to a lot of other impacts are going to exist within the debate. I think that opening government has an awfully naive characterization over how this is going to work. It's going to be an individual who is universally loved by like every single person and extremely accountable to them. The problem with this characterization is that there is a massive collective action problem that exists when it comes to choosing an individual leader. That is, how on earth are you just going to convince a bunch of people, even on like a regional level, like we're talking about like millions, at the very least hundreds of thousands of people, that like you are the next Gadol that you are going to exist. As a Gadol, then you have the dilemma. What is the easiest way that you can ultimately convince people of your own legitimacy and of your own authority? I think that what the Gadol needs to do are to turn to actors within society who have a high level of authority and legitimacy in order to reinforce what their own authority actually is. Who are these powerful actors? I think that firstly, this is probably going to be privileged elites and state-based structures that ultimately exist, government officials of a high level of legitimacy. The reason for this is that these people often have control over things like state-run media and are often generally respected by the people, meaning that they are a useful ally to ultimately have. And more importantly, I also think extremely privileged and wealthy individuals within society overall. The privileged elite often has money to help the Gadol's campaigning process to get the support of the people. They often have bought up and have more control over media channels that exist. And based on awful capitalistic norms that exist within society, the privileged elites are often seen as being the most smart, the most credible. So if credible people within society are saying this person is the next Gadol, where they're more likely to side with them and ultimately support the individual. What then does this characterization mean? Firstly, we're more likely to have an individual who caters toward the privileged minority within society overall and are less likely going to have things like caring about issues like mass poverty that religion tends to care about under the status quo. I think that secondly, the Gadol is more likely to reify the authority of the state to a much larger extent, because I think that what you end up creating is a weird kind of like symbiotic bond where the where the new Gadol benefits from state-based support to a massive extent, with the promise of we will support you as the next Gadol if you as a Gadol are willing to then support and speak out toward the state-based structure. So I think that the fusion between state and religion is going to become a lot more intricate under their side of the house, where you basically use religious justifications for state-based structures to a much larger extent. I think the reason why this is problematic is that you're then likely to get a greater degree of complacency with state-based systems that exist. I think the push for democratization in a lot of circumstances are going to be lower if you literally think that taking those kind of actions are violating the word of God. I think that people should have the choice if they want to democratize states, and I think it's generally a good system of government because insofar as people are brutally coerced under state structures, it are better to maximize the voice that people have within those systems, both as a reparative obligation, but also to actually have their preferences reflected within the context of the state that exists. Even if states are authoritarian under either side of the house, accountability is likely to be substantially lower. What then does a comparative ultimately look like? Because I do want to engage with OG's thing of like religious institutions are out of touch and they are extremely bad. I think that the first thing to say is that even if all of their characterization is true, they are a religious institution, they are not the state. Given that the state controls more spheres of our lives, we prefer more accountability being directed toward the state. Secondly, though, I think that doctrine of most major religions are one that emphasizes charity and giving to the poor to a massive extent. This is empirically true if we look to most religious scripture. And it literally explicitly says, like, a religious imperative is to help the poor. But the historical reason for this is that given that the masses tended to be extremely poor, there was an incentive to include them within religious scripture in order to maximize your buy-in toward religious structures, meaning it's likely to be in a more majoritarian, positive, and beneficial way that ultimately exists. Why does outweigh conflict argument? Firstly, it is genuinely unclear that some people dying matters more than religious fulfillment that individuals are able to extract on a daily basis. Given that like the majority of people throughout history have been religious and they have to interact with that on like literally a daily basis, where they often have to think about religion, I think that religion is probably something that is more fulfilling. Secondly, a lot of the time, like religion is an excuse to go to war, but people often want to engage in infighting for things like power and money and all of that stuff anyways. Finally, look at CG's responses about how this is often something that ends up being symmetric in a lot of cases. Secondly, let's talk about why the Gadol is going to be more paranoid. The first thing that I want to outline here are why priests are still going to exist. The first reason for this is that they're often popular insofar as they allow a more grassroots connection to religion that ultimately exists, and like someone you can actually like communicate with, where not everyone is able to meet the Gadol and the supreme leader. But secondly, they're often just going to be lower level people who want to like rise to religious power insofar as they might like power trips, or they just generally believe in a particular like ideology and version of religion want to perpetuate that. OG, before I continue.
All modern states evolved in close partnerships with hierarchical religious institutions. So in your best case, both leaders are chosen in bad ways. The difference
Our cases that the historical timeline in which this happened would have been substantially different. Like religion and state were moved from each other over time. The historical fusion would have occurred for substantially more years. So priests still exist. Therefore, the largest difference between the two sides is like, do you have more priests who are challenging authority or not? Under our side of the house, the Gadol is always going to be extremely paranoid because there's always the threat that like lower level religious figures are going to defect from them, as opposed to if that happens under their side of the house, the church can like disown religious leaders insofar doctrine is unified. This is bad for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it means that the Gadol is going to have to use substantially more religious resources to like pay off religious leaders in the form of things like patronage networks, demanding things like higher indulgences from individual people on the ground, and is using more money in general in order to pay off people to guarantee a degree of loyalty. But secondly, when the Gadol is more paranoid, this is when they emphasize the fact that there's only one kind of religious doctrine and interpretation and everyone else are heretics. This is better than O's moderation mechanism, which is like the Gadol is going to be around for a long time. Newsflash, so are religious leaders. It's bad to make the Gadol paranoid to only reinforce one kind of doctrinal authority that exists, as opposed to the status quo where it's allowed to be more flexible when an individual feels a lot more secure in their own power. For all of these reasons, I'm proud to stand in closing opposition.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the government whip. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay, I will take POIs in chat. Good morning, everyone. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in the speech. First, the shape of the ensuing religion and CO's failure to respond. Secondly, the effects of that religion and OO's failure to just fail, like actually consider what failure might look like. And then thirdly, an illustration of why our case is the most important impact in the debate. First of all, the shape of the religion. CO has 2 contentions to respond to us. They first say is that these religions will still be large, And their point is some intersubjectivity. First response, it's not clear why the reaction is to coalesce. Surely an increased level of subjectivity is a good reason for people to realize we shouldn't be coalescing together if there's very little actually binding us together. But secondly, this directly contradicts OO's point on fracturing. There presumably must be some fracturing for OO's material to even manifest, which means that by rules of debate, you cannot believe this to be standing because it directly contradicts the standing material from opening opposition. Secondly, they then make a point about how gadols will be chosen badly because privileged elites have a lot of control over media and are generally respected. First response, even if privileged elites have money, it's not clear that they stop caring or catering to people because they still have to somehow persuade people. Just because they have money doing it doesn't mean that they still can't, that they don't use it to change policies or somehow cater to the poor. But secondly, is that we illustrate the actual incentive for privileged elites to do this is much less if each individual religion has less money for you to take advantage of. So the actual incentive to co-opt religions decreases on our side. So they're solving a problem that they create. The second thing on the shape of religion is about gadols being paranoid, which is their second contention in closing opposition. They have two proofs for this, and they rely on the construction of priests still existing. They say people will still want priests to connect you to religion, and lower level people still want to rise to power. First, this is wrong because it doesn't deal with our pre-buttal, which actually deals with these two specific things, that this change in the hierarchy of the religion obviates for the need for a priest to connect you to a religion and the desire for a rise to power if the perception of people and church membership is substantially more egalitarian, right? Our argument is that this precurses these desires to have hierarchy because we, at the very beginning, remove that need for hierarchy in the first place. If gadols are so paranoid about it, then the very first gadol will do things that obviate the need for that hierarchy in the first place. Which is why when their proof is that it is nice to have someone to connect you to religion, that's not the point. Our argument is that it is better to be able to self-determine and articulate that for yourself. Note, this also analytically fills in a very large gap in the debate that nobody really asks, which is, what do people want? I think opening government just somewhat assumes that people in general like to be represented without ever articulating the kind of thing that people want. And as we illustrate, these are the kinds of things that bring people closer to the divine, closer to their conception of God, but moreover, bring them to happier lives. We also illustrate that later in the argument, but in the third part of this speech. But just quite clearly, we're already winning this debate because we illustrate the shape of the religion is conducive far better. Lastly, then, it's also just not clear why paranoia manifests in bad ways as opposed to good ways. Like this could also just manifest in them trying to cater to as many people as possible because they desperately want people's support. So I really don't know why this paranoia is bad. So that's closing opposition out of this debate. Secondly, then, opening opposition's failure to consider failure. The first thing I want to point out is they have really no response to just what happens if the gadol you pick is bad. Their only response is feebly to say, actually, at the time they had buy-in, so they must be good. First response, there's no guarantee they had buy-in at the time. For all we know, closing opposition could be right. They could have just had the most resources at the time. We're going to have had the most elite sponsors. It's not clear to me that just because they were leaders at the time, they had popular buy-in and support. Secondly, there's no guarantee that the doctrine remains good, even if they were good at the beginning. This might work for the very first few years of that religion, but structurally, we can expect it to fail to accommodate the needs and interests of people as historical contexts radically diverge from their initial points. Like how for example, it was hypothesized that men were closer to God because they don't give birth like women who are apparently closer to beasts in the eyes of religious people. But now that as our understanding of science and just, general common sense improves over time, we are capable of making rational judgments about that religion, which is why we substantially improve the understanding of that religion and the way that religion integrates with our lives. But then they say, you'll moderate because people will leave. It's not clear why the reaction of a supreme leader with very little internal accountability would moderate people as opposed to having structures that prevent people from leaving, which is what we see systemically today, how they intertwine with communities like family and communities like community, which make it substantially difficult for you to leave because of the fact that you, as a supreme authority, have substantial amounts of control over what kind of doctrine that may be imposed. Secondly, then, they also just have an internal contradiction in their case. You cannot both simultaneously believe that gadols are too powerful and also too weak that they can't standardize any doctrine whatsoever. But beyond that, I think what Greg does, and don't shake your head, I mean, you had the chance to prove this in your speech, you just didn't. We also illustrate that religious fracturing is not bad, presuming it's true, right? Your presupposition is that once people disagree, they start stabbing. Our point is that this happens when locked in a rigid hierarchy that leaves violence as the only means of recourse against an institutionalized authority. When the mechanism for soothing ideological divides that people have a natural platform for vigorous discussion is when people stop But I also want to illustrate division never builds up to explicit conflict, since the Gadol would be trivially derelict in their duty to provide people spiritual solace if they are dying on foreign fields for no good reason. The hard institutional requirements to build up some form of armed force is simply not present without a wide-scale networks of a centralized religion. So as such, opening opposition is out of this debate. I'll take this POI now from them.
OG says that hierarchy exists as a check on the Gadol. You say hierarchy disappears. This is a knife. CO is non-mutually exclusive because states evolve in tandem with religion in either world. Our accountability claim still stands because religious leaders can lose authority, but the Gadol can't, which is why the Gadol has no incentive to be good and why infighting happens more.
Well, yeah, the hierarchy of the vote, like that's the accountability mechanism. That's the only thing that remains. Anyway, our case, we simply illustrate that we have the largest, most persuasive, and most vulnerable, dealing with the most vulnerable impacts in this debate. Number one, we win the abuse claim substantially more clearly because by illustrating that the repressive norms never accumulate with a steam to transition into widespread norms and affect people's lives. Secondly, we illustrate that the kind of religious goals you have are closer to your way of life and are far more proximate to what you feel is achievable for yourself, which is a more direct way of simply believing that people are closer to God, which illustrates that a source of persistent dissatisfaction, of having to live up to the ideals of saints, of forever being perennially dissatisfied with their own sins, of all of opening opposition and closing opposition mechanizations about hell are brushed away the moment at which people have substantially more control over the arraying of their lives and the arraying of the way that they believe they should be sinning or not be sinning or acting. But thirdly, we also illustrate this leads to outsized reform in wider society, that leads to systemic changes not only in the way that things are done in their spiritual and religious lives, but also economic reform, the way that social advancement works. We think substantially smaller religions allows for a far more egalitarian conception of the world around them, as well as societies that may emerge from this society, from this debate. At the end of this speech, not only does closing government win by winning every plausible issue, we also substantially widen the margin on each possible pre-existing issue that happens in top half, which is why we have two additional meta outside of weighing reasons, but meta weighing reasons between those weighing reasons to give closing government the win. It is for this reason, then, you must affirm.